Kim Jong Un, the young enigmatic leader of North Korea, rose to power amid uncertainty and global skepticism. As he took the reins from his father, Kim Jong Il, no one could have predicted the ruthless path he would carve for himself and his nation. Under his iron grip, North Koreans found themselves trapped in a world of fear, surveillance, and unimaginable oppression, where even the smallest act of defiance could cost them their lives. How did this once unknown figure transform into a leader who would shape the fate of millions, and what were the true costs of his absolute power? In 2011, the world was shocked by the sudden death of Kim Jong-il, the supreme leader of North Korea, leaving the country in a state of uncertainty. For years, Kim Jong-il had ruled with an iron fist, maintaining control over every aspect of North Korean life. His unexpected passing sparked fears of instability, both within the country and internationally. People were unsure who would rise to take his place, and the world wondered if the regime would collapse or become even more oppressive. Against all expectations, Kim Jong-il's youngest son, Kim Jong Un, emerged as the successor. He was barely in his late 20s, inexperienced in leadership, and known to the public mostly through his rare appearances as a child. Few had expected him to rise to power, let alone maintain control over the totalitarian regime his father had built. Kim Jong-un's swift rise surprised many, and rumors swirled about his capabilities. Would he be able to keep the country together, or would North Korea fall into chaos? To the outside world, the idea of a young, untested leader at the helm of one of the most secretive and volatile nations seemed improbable. Yet, Kim Jong-un quickly proved he would not only step into his father's shoes, but would also double down on the practices that kept North Korea isolated. He carried forward the strict policies of control, fear, and military-first priorities, determined to solidify his power. His rapid rise to power came with an iron grip, and he wasted no time asserting his authority. The world watched, unsure of what the future held for the enigmatic new leader, but within North Korea, the people had no choice but to follow. When Kim Jong-un took power, it quickly became evident that his rule would be marked by an even greater sense of fear and control than under his father. At first, many North Koreans were hopeful that his younger age might bring a shift toward progress or reform. However, as the months passed, it became clear that his leadership would follow in the footsteps of Kim Jong-il's oppressive regime, with even harsher measures. Public executions became more frequent and more brutal, often serving as chilling reminders of what awaited those who challenged the authority of the state. These executions were carried out in public squares, where crowds were forced to watch, instilling terror in the population and ensuring compliance. The people of North Korea, already living under intense restrictions, now faced an even more suffocating environment. Any sign of dissent, no matter how small, could lead to unimaginable consequences. Even expressions of frustration or discontent could be seen as acts of treason. The regime monitored every aspect of daily life, from phone calls to the things people talked about in the privacy of their homes. Fear spread like wildfire as people learned to distrust even their closest friends and family, knowing that anyone could be an informant for the government. Kim Jong-un also ramped up the state's control over education, ensuring that every child was indoctrinated from an early age. The country's young people were taught to revere Kim Jong-un as a divine figure, the great successor who would lead the nation to greatness. Teachers and students alike lived under constant scrutiny, with loyalty to the regime being the highest virtue. As the fear deepened, so did the belief in the infallibility of the regime, and those who questioned it, even silently, risked being swept away into the dark, unspoken corners of the system. As Kim Jong-un solidified his rule, he implemented an even more sophisticated system of control, one that permeated every aspect of daily life in North Korea. The state became an omnipresent force, watching, monitoring, and dictating the choices of its citizens. Surveillance became a cornerstone of the regime's power. Ordinary citizens were constantly watched, not only by government agents, but also by one another. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members were expected to report any suspicious behavior, creating a climate of paranoia that was nearly impossible to escape. No one knew who could be trusted, and even the smallest of actions, such as speaking too freely in private, could lead to dire consequences. The state also imposed strict limitations on movement, both within the country and beyond. Citizens were required to carry identification papers that tracked their movements, making travel between cities and villages difficult without government permission. The concept of personal freedom barely existed. People were born into a life controlled by the regime, and their entire existence was dictated by the state's needs. Jobs, education, and even marriage were subject to approval, with loyalty to Kim Jong Un being the ultimate measure of worth. This control extended to the media, which was entirely state-run. No foreign news sources were allowed, and all information was filtered through the government's lens. As Kim Jong Un's grip on power tightened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge within the inner circles of North Korea's leadership. High-ranking officials, many of whom had been loyal to Kim Jong-il and had helped solidify Kim Jong Un's rise to power, began to disappear under mysterious circumstances. The world watched in disbelief as the purges of top officials escalated, sending shockwaves through the country's political system. Those who had once enjoyed privileged positions in the regime suddenly found themselves caught in a web of suspicion, with no one safe from the wrath of the leader. The most shocking and widely reported case was that of Jang Thaek, Kim Jong Un's uncle, and one of the most powerful figures in North Korea at the time. In 2013, Yang was arrested, accused of treason, and executed in a brutal manner. The public spectacle of his death was meant to send a chilling message. No one, not even the closest family members of Kim Jong Un, was beyond reproach. The execution was swift and absolute, and it marked a clear turning point in Kim Jong Un's consolidation of power. After Jang's execution, a series of high-profile disappearances followed. Some were reported to have been executed by firing squad, while others were simply erased from public life, with their fates left unknown. Rumors of purges within the regime grew louder, but the truth was obscured by the tight control the government maintained over information. The public was left in the dark, forced to accept the regime's narrative without question. These disappearances were not just a sign of Kim Jong Un's ruthless approach to maintaining power, but also a demonstration of the extent to which fear had taken hold of the entire nation. Even those at the highest levels of power were disposable in the eyes of the leader, a stark reminder of how little anyone's life truly mattered in the eyes of the regime. The fear and uncertainty surrounding these purges continued to haunt the people of North Korea, with no one able to predict who might be next to disappear into the dark, unforgiving shadows of the regime. Under Kim Jong Un, the military-first policy became more pronounced than ever before, consuming the country's resources and pushing the nation to its limits. This policy, which prioritized the military above all else, diverted most of North Korea's already limited resources towards strengthening the armed forces, particularly its nuclear weapons program. While the elite lived in relative comfort, the average citizen faced ever-deepening hardship. Food shortages became a constant problem, with many families struggling to find enough to eat. The streets were often lined with beggars, and the once vibrant agricultural fields were now barren from years of mismanagement and neglect. The military, however, seemed to thrive under Kim Jong Un's rule. Soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and often given special privileges not available to the general population. Military parades and displays of strength became common, with Kim Jong Un using these events to both showcase the power of his regime and distract from the growing suffering of the people. The government's focus on military development and nuclear weapons, combined with the ever-present fear of external threats, allowed Kim Jong Un to maintain a facade of strength while his people lived in constant struggle. While ordinary citizens were left to fend for themselves, the ruling elite continued to live lavishly, enjoying the benefits of their position. Kim Jong Un's inner circle was able to indulge in luxuries that were out of reach for the vast majority of the population. These stark inequalities between the elite and the common people bred resentment. But dissent was a dangerous thing. Even expressing dissatisfaction could result in imprisonment or worse. As the country's resources were drained to feed the military machine, life for North Koreans became even more fragile. People who once had hopes of reform now resigned themselves to a life where survival was their only concern. The regime's military ambitions were at the forefront of its priorities, and the human cost of this obsession with power was becoming impossible to ignore, even as the government continued to hide the true extent of the suffering from the outside world. Under Kim Jong Un, the regime's grip on reality became more tightly controlled than ever before. The government's propaganda machine worked overtime to craft an image of North Korea as a thriving, powerful nation, led by a fearless and divine leader. Every aspect of life was shaped by this narrative. State-run media, which was the only source of information allowed in the country, bombarded the population with glorified images of Kim Jong Un, portraying him as the protector of the Bangkaikath nation, a genius strategist and a man capable of bringing prosperity to the people. His military accomplishments, such as nuclear tests and missile launches, were broadcast as triumphs for the country, despite the growing suffering of the population. The regime went to great lengths to create a cult of personality around Kim Jong Un. Statues, portraits, and murals of him were displayed everywhere, from government buildings to schools, with citizens often required to show their reverence by bowing before them. Children were taught to worship him as a godlike figure, and school lessons were centered around his supposed greatness. The message was clear. To question Kim Jong Un was to commit an unforgivable sin. No dissent, no matter how small, could be tolerated. This control over information extended to the outside world. The people of North Korea were kept in the dark about the true state of the world, with any form of foreign media or contact strictly forbidden. The regime heavily monitored communication, making it nearly impossible for North Koreans to access news or information from the outside. As a result, the average citizen had little understanding of life beyond their borders. This isolation kept the people trapped in the regime's tightly constructed reality, where the outside world was often painted as hostile and inferior, and where Kim Jong Un's leadership was the only salvation. In this distorted reality, hope for change was difficult to cultivate, as the population remained unaware of the true scale of their own oppression. Under Kim Jong Un, North Korea's isolation from the rest of the world became even more pronounced. The country was effectively sealed off, with the regime taking extreme measures to prevent outside influences from penetrating its borders. International travel was heavily restricted, and ordinary citizens were forbidden from leaving the country. Only the highest-ranking officials and the privileged elite were allowed to travel abroad, and even then, their movements were closely monitored. For the majority of North Koreans, the world beyond their borders seemed like an unreachable and often frightening place. The government's obsession with control extended to the very flow of information. The internet was strictly regulated, with the vast majority of the population having no access to global networks. Instead, they were limited to a small, government-controlled intranet that offered only approved content, all curated to reinforce the regime's narrative. This made it nearly impossible for North Koreans to access foreign news, learn about life outside their country, or even communicate freely with the outside world. Those caught attempting to access foreign websites or use unauthorized communication devices faced severe punishment, ranging from imprisonment to execution. The outside world, with its diverse cultures, ideologies, and technologies, was presented as a dangerous and corrupt place in the government's propaganda. The regime portrayed foreign countries, particularly the United States and South Korea, as enemies, using the threat of invasion or sabotage as a means to justify their isolationist policies. To the people of North Korea, the world outside their borders was often shrouded in mystery, and the regime worked tirelessly to keep them in the dark. For many, the country's isolation meant a lifetime of limited opportunities. Dreams of experiencing the outside world were replaced by a harsh reality of living under constant surveillance and control. In this environment, North Koreans had little knowledge of what was truly happening beyond their borders, making them more reliant on the regime's narrative and less likely to question the oppressive system they were trapped in. As the years passed under Kim Jong Un's rule, more and more North Koreans began to escape the regime's grip, risking everything for a chance at freedom. Defection became one of the few ways to break free from the suffocating control of the state. However, it was not an easy escape. The journey to freedom was fraught with danger, and many defectors faced brutal obstacles along the way. The stories of those who managed to flee were filled with hardship, loss, and survival against all odds. Defectors who successfully crossed the border into China faced the immediate threat of being captured and deported back to North Korea. If they were caught, the consequences were dire, often torture, imprisonment in labor camps, or even execution. Despite these risks, many chose to take the chance, driven by the hope that life outside the totalitarian regime could offer something better. However, China had its own strict policies regarding North Korean defectors, and most were forced into hiding, relying on underground networks to help them escape to third countries, such as South Korea or other parts of Southeast Asia. Even if they made it that far, the journey was long and treacherous, often requiring months or years of living in the shadows, constantly evading capture. The stories of the defectors who made it to South Korea were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Many left behind their families, knowing that the regime would likely punish their loved ones for their escape. For those who had been raised in the regime's all-encompassing propaganda, adjusting to life in a free society was a difficult process. Many defectors struggled to understand the world outside North Korea, and the trauma of years spent under constant fear and oppression lingered long after they had found safety. Yet despite the overwhelming challenges they faced, these brave individuals represented a flicker of hope for those still trapped within the regime's iron grip, proving that the desire for freedom could never be completely extinguished, even in the darkest of circumstances. As the years went by, the world began to take notice of the growing tension surrounding Kim Jong Un's North Korea. His regime's increasingly aggressive actions on the international stage, particularly with its nuclear tests and missile launches, brought the country into the global spotlight. For the North Korean people, however, these external threats seemed distant, overshadowed by their own daily struggles for survival. While Kim Jong Un's government pursued nuclear power as a symbol of strength and defiance, the people of North Korea faced hunger, poverty, and fear. The harsh reality of life in the country stood in stark contrast to the images of military might broadcast by the regime. The constant military provocations, coupled with Kim Jong Un's erratic behavior, left the international community on edge. Tensions between North Korea and other countries, especially the United States and South Korea, reached alarming levels. The regime's belligerent rhetoric and nuclear weapons testing sparked widespread concern that war could break out at any moment. For North Koreans, however, life went on, often under the shadow of these escalating threats. Citizens were forced to continue their daily routines, hiding their fear of a potential conflict while living under the ever-present weight of Kim Jong Un's authoritarian rule. Yet, even as the world worried about the possibility of war, the regime maintained an ironclad hold over its people, convincing them that the nuclear tests and military provocations were justified acts of self-defense against foreign enemies. North Koreans were told that their country was under constant threat, and the regime's military power was the only thing standing between them and destruction. This constant state of alert kept the people in a cycle of anxiety, while the government used the external tension to justify its oppressive policies and military-first agenda. Despite the growing pressure from the international community, Kim Jong Un's regime showed no signs of backing down, and the citizens of North Korea were left to wonder if their lives would be forever shaped by the threat of war. The true cost of Kim Jong Un's power became increasingly apparent as the years passed, revealing the toll it had taken on both the people and the nation. For the citizens of North Korea, the price of living under such a regime was devastating. With the country's resources funneled into military projects, nuclear ambitions, and the strengthening of Kim Jong Un's rule, the basic needs of the people were consistently neglected. Food shortages and a lack of basic necessities became regular occurrences, yet the regime continued to boast of its military prowess and national strength. The disparity between the elite and the common citizens was vast. While the leaders lived in luxury, the average North Korean was forced to endure unimaginable hardships just to survive. The people of North Korea existed under a constant state of fear, never knowing if their next word, action, or even thought could lead to imprisonment or death. Public executions became a routine part of life, sending a clear message to the population. Loyalty to Kim Jong Un was not just expected, it was demanded under penalty of death. Many of those who were punished were simply guilty of small acts of defiance, having contact with foreigners, discussing politics, or even failing to show enough reverence to the regime. The constant surveillance made it nearly impossible to trust anyone, as even close family members could be informants for the state. Despite this, there remained a flicker of hope among some North Koreans. The stories of defectors who made it out of the country inspired a quiet belief that escape was possible. But for the majority of the population, breaking free from the regime was unimaginable. The price of power for Kim Jong Un had been paid in human suffering, with a nation that was both trapped and silenced by its own leader. The people of North Korea were left wondering if they would ever see a future beyond the suffocating control of the regime, or if their lives would forever be consumed by fear, oppression, and the unyielding will of a single man.